Recorded Books is pleased to present the Modern Scholar Series, where great professors teach you. Today we begin a course entitled Medieval Mysteries, the history behind the myths of Middle Ages. Your professor will be Thomas F. Madden. Thomas F. Madden is professor of history and director of the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies at St. Louis University. His numerous publications include The Concise History of the Crusades, Rowman and Littlefield, 2013. Venice, A New History, Viking, 2012. Empires of Trust, Viking, 2008. Enrico Dandolo and the Rise of Venice, Johns Hopkins University Press, 2003. And The Fourth Crusade, University of Pennsylvania Press, 1997. He is a recognized expert on pre-modern history, appearing in such venues as the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, and the History Channel. His scholarly awards include the Haskins Medal of the Medieval Academy of America and the Otto Grundler Prize of the Medieval Institute. He is a Fellow of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation and a Fellow of the Medieval Academy of America. Medieval Mysteries, the history behind the myths of the Middle Ages. Lecture 7. Sailing Off the Edge of the World, the Myth of the Flat Earth.
In this lecture, we're going to look at the medieval myth of the flat earth. In other words, what did the people of the Middle Ages think when they thought about what the earth was like? Now, we commonly believe that people in the Middle Ages thought that the world was flat. Of course they did. I mean, that's why they didn't sail off to the west, because they believed that they would fall off the edge. And as we well know, it was really only Christopher Columbus who had the guts to say that the world was round and to go and prove the world was round by sailing off and discovering the New World. So is that what people thought during the Middle Ages? And in fact, is it what everybody thought before Christopher Columbus demonstrated to them that the world was, in fact, round? To answer that question, I think the first thing to remember is that people are not stupid. Just because they lived in the past does not mean that they were idiots. This is a fallacy that I'll talk more about later, but it's one that historians refer to as presentism. It's the idea that all of the things that we think and know today are inherently superior to anything that people thought and knew in the past. And that our approaches to things and all of the things that we think are valuable or important are in fact the truth, that those things truly are important and that those things will never change. While the people in the past, because they view things the way they do and because they think the things they do, they're just wrong. They should be essentially ridiculed for it. That is in fact not the case. And in this case, what the world looks like, it is certainly not the case. Anyone with any thought whatsoever could tell that the earth was not flat, that it was in fact round. You can do it a number of ways. You can prove it yourself. For example, if you look at a lunar eclipse, lunar eclipses are not that rare. They happen with some regularity. And you can watch them in the evening. You watch a moon, and it will go from being full to slowly becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. And when you can clearly see that it is an orb, it's a circle that is going across the face of the moon as the night goes on. And the ancients well understood that that was the shadow that they on the earth were casting on the moon. And therefore, since that shadow was circular, that only made sense that the earth was round. There are other ways you can see it too. And again, this is the way the ancients saw it, say in ancient Greece. If you're in ancient Greece or anywhere in the ancient world and you're standing, say on a port or on the seashore, and you watch a ship sail away from you, and it sails up and has flags flying from the top, and it sails away and gets further and further from you, it goes and goes, and it looks smaller and smaller the farther it goes. But it doesn't just keep going and going and going until it's so small you can't see it. Rather, if you watch it, and it's a large enough ship, you will see that pretty soon you don't see the bottom of the ship so well any longer. And then, after a while, really all you can see is the mast of the ship. And then finally, just the flags. In other words, the ship has gone far enough away that the bottom portions of it are being obscured by the curvature of the earth. And this obscuring by the curvature of the earth is one of the ways in which the ancient Greeks were able to first discern that the earth was a globe, and secondly, its size. So in the 6th century BC, Pythagoras had demonstrated clearly that the earth was round by using mathematics. And this was widely accepted in ancient Greece. Indeed, in 330 BC, Aristotle used additional evidence to demonstrate that the earth was clearly round. In the 2nd century BC, we're talking about BC here, long before the Middle Ages, Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth by using geometry, and he calculated it very close to the actual circumference of the earth. So this was not rocket science. People with some understanding of geometry and mathematics, and who could simply observe the way the ancient Greeks did, they could figure out not only that the earth was round, but they could figure out how large the earth was. And that was done long before the Middle Ages. So most people, therefore, knew, and there was never any question, that the world was round. They knew it before the Middle Ages, and they knew it in the Middle Ages. Now, they did not know what was on it all, of course. They had not explored the world, which was simply not possible for them given the technologies. In the 2nd century BC, Crates of Malus posited that there were 4 continents, and that these 4 continents were separated by oceans. And there were 2 in the northern hemisphere and 2 in the southern hemisphere, he believed. And he believed that because these oceans that separated them on the 2 hemispheres were so large that it was not possible to get to the other continents. And he also believed that it was not possible for you to go to the continents in the southern hemisphere because he said that there was a hot zone that was essentially the equator, and it was so hot that it was not possible to get through it, and therefore there was no way to get to the other side. This naturally raised the question, though, whether you can get there or not, is there life in the southern hemisphere? And he talked about this, and many other people talked about it too, about the possibility of people who lived on the other side, in the southern hemisphere, on the other side of the earth. And they were referred to as the Antipodes, or the people with the feet on the other side. And the question was whether these Antipodes, were they the same as us? If they exist, are they the same as us? Because a lot of people assumed that if the earth is a globe, and if we're essentially on the top of it, because we must be, because we're standing on it, then if you were on the bottom, wouldn't you need to have your feet be the opposite direction because you're upside down all the time? And since you're upside down all the time, you must have to have your feet over your head somehow so you can walk around. It wasn't quite understood as to how that might work. But there was a lot of debate, much the same way people today might debate whether there's life on other planets. There was a lot of debate whether there were any Antipodes on the other side. But nobody doubted that the world was round or it was of the size that it in fact is. We know that in the Middle Ages, everyone believed that the world was round. Any time the world is referred to in medieval documents, it's always referred to as an orb. Christian writers always referred to the orb of the earth in their writings. I'm thinking of like the writings of the church fathers in the 4th and 5th centuries. To give an example, St. Augustine, writing in the 5th century, he had no question at all about the size and the shape of the earth, but he did write about whether the Antipodes existed, whether these other people existed. Augustine argued that he thought it was foolish to speculate on whether they existed or not, since there was no way to know whether there was any people there, or in fact, he said, whether there was any land there. It could, after all, just be ocean. Augustine also wondered if there were people on the other side of the planet, whether they were actually descendants of Adam, and whether knowledge of Christ had ever come to them. But again, he's purely speculating on this. The maps that were produced in the Middle Ages, and there were a number of them, mostly were fantastic, but they were always round, and the planet was referred to always as the globus terrae, the globe of the earth, the orb of the earth. And if you think about the kinds of things that both Roman emperors and medieval kings would use to demonstrate their power, think of what they hold in their hand. It's an orb with a cross over it, and the orb represents their dominion over the earth. Isidore of Seville was a scholar who died in 636, and in his writing, he plainly describes the earth as a globe, and he furthermore recognizes that the sun lit the other side of the globe at night. He knew that the sun wasn't just disappearing, that it was going around the earth. They believed the earth was stationary in the middle of the universe, but that the sun was revolving around the earth and that it was lighting the other side. So when it's night here, it's daytime on the other side of the earth. Isidore of Seville produced the famous, what's called nowadays a T-map, which was a circle in which you have the continent of Asia at the top, and that's over the T, and then you have Europe and Africa on the bottom two sides of the T, and the T itself is meant to represent the waters, the Mediterranean waters that separate them. But this T-map, even though it's round, one of the purposes of it too is to have Jerusalem right near the center. It was considered just a small part of the earth. It was the known part of the earth. Bede, who we talked about a little earlier in these lectures, he dies in 735. He explains in his writings the variation in day length is caused by, as he puts it, the roundness of the earth, nor not without reason is it called the orb of the world. It is set like a sphere in the middle of the whole universe. In fact, it's rather strange to think that medieval writers and thinkers, or just common people, would think that the world was flat, particularly given that clergy in the Middle Ages had to be able to keep accurate calendars because they needed to be able to keep track of when Easter was coming. Easter does not arrive at the same date every year. It's based on a lunar calendar. And therefore, to be able to make those calculations, they had to be able to keep accurate calendars. And therefore, the whole question of whether the earth was round or not was not a question. No one would have suggested that the world was flat. And in fact, in the Middle Ages, you had some people using Greek geography and geometry to estimate the size of the earth. In fact, Hermann Contractus, who lived in the 11th century, did exactly that. And he was fairly accurate in his computations. The greatest of the medieval philosophers, St. Thomas Aquinas, in his writings, mentions frequently the round earth without any thought that his reader might doubt it. In one section, he says, for example, quote, "The physicist proves the earth to be round by one means, the astronomer by another. For the latter proves this by means of mathematics. For example, the shapes of eclipses or something of the sort, while the former proves it by means of physics, for example, by the movement of heavy bodies toward the center, and so forth." So it's very, very clear that everyone in the Middle Ages, from the peasant on up, knew very well that the world was round. In fact, there is no counter-narrative. There is really no one, except for, we'll mention in a moment, there are a few little references that will come from a few people who really had no importance in the Middle Ages to questioning the roundness of the earth. But aside from that, there's no counter-narrative at all in this. The only sources that we have, and they're constant, is that everyone understood that the world was a round thing. This brings us back then to the myth. And that means, of course, back to Christopher Columbus. How is it that most people believe that Christopher Columbus argued that the world was round and that he proved that the world was round by going to the New World? Well, on the face of it, we now know that in the Middle Ages, everyone knew the world was round. So Christopher Columbus would not get very far by simply saying the world is round and therefore I want to sail west. That wouldn't be much of an argument because everyone already understood that the world was round. What Christopher Columbus did when he went to Spain and asked for funding from Ferdinand and Isabella, he came with his own computations. And his computations had some severe errors in them. Christopher Columbus did not believe that the world was round and everyone else thought it was flat. Christopher Columbus believed that the world was small and that everyone else thought it was big. And in this case, everyone else was right. When people say, oh, well, they laughed at Christopher Columbus when he said the world was round, well, they're wrong. But even when they say, well, they laughed at Christopher Columbus when he said what he wanted to do, well, they were right to laugh at him. His computations were completely wrong. I'll explain. Christopher Columbus really made two fairly important mistakes. The Roman geographer Ptolemy, and all of geography in the Middle Ages was based on the work of Ptolemy, had reckoned that the coast of Asia was about 180 degrees of longitude east of the Canary Islands. Now, this was a widely accepted figure, and it's not too far off the mark, actually. Columbus, however, discounted this. He believed that it was based on a number of errors. And in fact, it was actually Columbus who had made a number of errors on this. But he also based his kind of reworking of that distance based on reading Marco Polo, who had been to China, and he believed as a result of that Asia and Japan actually were closer to Europe. He insisted, therefore, that the Atlantic Ocean stretched 77 degrees, not 180, from Portugal to the coast of Japan. And then from the Canary Islands to Japan, that would even be less. He then, and this is the second mistake, he then mixed up the lengths of measurement. He believed that each one of those degrees was a mile, but an Italian mile. Remember, Columbus is Genoese. And an Italian mile was 1,480 meters. In truth, though, each one of those degrees was an Arabic mile, and an Arabic mile is 2,177 meters. So putting all this together, Columbus believed that the distance between the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa and Japan was just a little over 3,000 miles. The true figure, if you used Ptolemy's projections, and the one that was widely accepted by all the scholars, was that the distance between the Canary Islands and the coast of Japan was a little more than 12,500 miles. So it's a very major disagreement here. Columbus believes it's just 3,000 miles. The scholars maintain that it's 12,500 miles. Now, the reason, therefore, that no ships were just simply sent off to the west to sail and to get to Asia was not because people expected that they would fall off the edge. It was because if it's 12,500 miles from the coast of the Canary Islands to Japan, then the ships of that day could not sustain people for that long. They would not have enough food and water to sustain them. If, however, the distance was only 3,000 miles, then it could be done. And so Columbus was arguing that it was only 3,000 miles. And if they would give him the ships and the money that he needed and the men, that he would demonstrate it. So Columbus was not arguing that the world was round. He was arguing that the world was small. And they discounted him because of these errors. And therefore, when people say, well, they laughed at Columbus, the fact is they were right. Their figures were right and Christopher Columbus's were wrong. It is true that Christopher Columbus was able to go 3,000 miles with his ship. But fortunately for him, that's where he hit the Caribbean, the islands of the Caribbean, which were roughly about 3,000 miles away. Had there been no Caribbean there, then he and his men would have died. They would never have returned. They were only able to return because they landed in the Caribbean and put aboard more supplies for the return journey. And in fact, as it's widely known, Columbus believed that he had come off the coast of Asia, and in fact, he believed it the rest of his life. If the dispute here, therefore, was not about the flat earth, where did that myth come from? Why is it that we all think that people in the Middle Ages saw the earth as flat? Well, as we saw in these previous lectures, many of the myths of the Middle Ages are actually the product of the Enlightenment. They are developed out of a kind of a prejudice during the Enlightenment, a belief by Enlightenment writers in the 18th century particularly, that ages that came before them were dark ages, and that the people were filled with ignorance and superstition. The earliest reference to a kind of a flat earth that can be found is actually in the 17th century, and this is from Cyrano de Bergerac. This is not the play, it's the real Cyrano de Bergerac. He actually wrote in 1650 probably what may be one of the first science fiction stories ever about the moon and the people on the moon. And in it, he quoted, incorrectly, St. Augustine as saying, quote, that in his day and age, the earth was as flat as a stove lid, and that it floated on water like half of a sliced orange, end quote. Now, this was probably a joke, but nonetheless, these type of jokes, as we've seen in these lectures, tend to be taken up by other people. We can also see it in Ludwig Holberg's comedy, which Ludwig Holberg was Danish, and he wrote a comedy called Erasmus Montanus, which was published in 1723. It was a satire. It was about kind of medieval-style academics. In the play, a young man goes off to Copenhagen, and he goes to university, and he comes back to his humble village, and he's very, very smart. But he's not scientific smart. He's more academic scholasticism smart. And so he comes back and he returns home, and he's Latinizing everything. In fact, his name, Erasmus Montanus, is Latinized. And he's doing things like proving, using syllogistic logic, that his mother is a rock and such things. It's meant to be a farce. Now, Ludwig Holberg, in this play, does something that we're going to see more of. He kind of conflates the idea of the arguments over whether the universe is heliocentric or geocentric with the idea of the round Earth. Now, the geocentric is the Ptolemaic model, in which the Earth is in the middle of the universe and the sun and all the planets and the stars rotate around it. The heliocentric is the way things really are, with the sun in the center and with the planets revolving around the sun. In the play, Erasmus finds out that his fiancée, who's a very simple country girl, won't marry him until he stops saying that the Earth revolves around the sun. And later, he relents because he wants to marry her, and he declares openly that Earth is as flat as a pancake. So here you can see it's kind of a problem where he's making fun of the fact that these simple people still believe that the Earth is stationary and that the sun revolves around it, which is wrong. But now he's conflating that with this idea that the Earth is somehow flat. And so by him saying that it's flat, that makes them happy. And this kind of error would pop up in all sorts of places. In fact, in one of the most famous of the Enlightenment writers, Thomas Jefferson of the United States. He may have known of this play, or it may have just been a very common error at the time. But in his Notes on the State of Virginia, written in 1784, he makes an argument against the idea that governments should be involved in trying to define religious tenets. And so he writes, "Government is just as infallible, too, when it fixes systems in physics. Galileo was sent to the Inquisition for affirming that the earth was a sphere. The government had declared it to be as flat as a trencher, and Galileo was obliged to abjure his error. This error, however, at length prevailed. The earth became a globe." Now, there's a few errors in this. Galileo never said that the earth was a sphere, because everyone knew that the earth was a sphere. What Galileo had argued was that the sun was at the center of the universe, and that the earth revolved around it. And so here again, you see Thomas Jefferson is mixing up, he's conflating those two things. And instead of believing that Galileo was arguing for a heliocentric model of the universe, he believes that Galileo was saying that the world is round, and the Inquisition forced him to say that the earth was flat, which is false. So bits of this idea coming out of the Enlightenment can be seen, and it must have been fairly commonly thought for it to appear in these very disparate sources. All of this, then, was distilled down by Washington Irving, American writer, probably best known for Rip Van Winkle. But in his 1828 book, he wrote A History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus. Now, Irving was an author. He was not an historian. He collected a number of materials to write this history of the Christopher Columbus, but what he didn't have, he just simply filled in with fiction. The book, however, became very popular, and it was commonly taken afterwards as being fact because it filled in so much of the story. At the meeting with scholars at Salamanca, Washington Irving describes this with lots of detail. He has Columbus enduring from these scholars after he gives his pitch, an inquisition of sorts. Just to read a short bit of this, Irving writes, "Such were the unlooked-for prejudices which Columbus had to encounter at the very outset of his conference, and which certainly relish more of the convent than the university. To his simplest proposition, the spherical form of the earth, were opposed figurative texts of Scripture. They observed that in the Psalms, the heavens are said to be extended like a hide, that is, according to commentators, the curtain or the covering of a tent, which among the ancient pastoral nations was formed of the hides of animals, and that St. Paul, in his epistle to the Hebrews, compares the heavens to a tabernacle or tent, extended over the earth, which they thence inferred must be flat. Columbus, who was a devoutly religious man, found that he was in danger of being convicted not merely of error, but of heterodoxy. Such are the specimens of the errors and prejudices, the mingled ignorance and erudition, and the pedantic bigotry with which Columbus had to contend throughout the examination of his theory." End quote. So in other words, the way Washington Irving casts this, Christopher Columbus is there, a man of fortitude and of science, and he gives his theory, he says that the world is round, and he's faced with people who are essentially just quoting Scripture to him. In the 19th century, this became even stronger and stronger because it was picked up with a narrative in the 19th century that religion and science are opposed. And this is a narrative that was given a lot of steam by the disputes over Darwinism in the 19th century. Scientists and people with a lot of education were strongly in favor of the Darwinist theories of evolution, and it appeared that churches and religions and churchmen were the ones most opposed to it. And so they projected this back and therefore embraced this idea that religion and science are always opposed to each other. To give a couple of examples, William Whewell in 1837 wrote A History of the Inductive Sciences, in which he drew from two very small examples in the Middle Ages in which there's a reference to a possible flat earth, that all medieval people believed in the flat earth. And this became the new line that one would read in many writings that come out in the 19th century. For example, John William Draper, who was an American chemist, he wrote a book, History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, in 1874. He noted that the church fathers refused to accept the round earth. Well, he essentially, he's saying that because they don't accept that there might be antipodes, that there might be people living on the other side of the earth, that must mean that they don't accept the round earth. And then he went on to argue that this shows that the Catholic Church has an inherent hatred of reason and science. Andrew Dixon White, who was the first president of Cornell University, and he had insisted that there be no religious ties to Cornell University because it would be, as he put it, an asylum of science. He was a Darwinist who really saw religious figures as standing in the way. And he wrote a book called The Warfare of Science in 1876, in which he cast medieval flat earth as an element in this warfare between dogmatic theology and scientific progress. In any case, the error, the idea that Middle Ages believed in flat Earth, was corrected in the 20th century due to serious scholarship. A number of people wrote various books, E.M.W. Tillyard's The Elizabethan World Picture, and also C.S. Lewis's work, The Discarded Image. Probably most important was Jeffrey Burton Russell's book, The Flat Earth, which was published in 1991. But much of this scholarship just continues to be ignored. Today, it's common to refer to people who are stupid or refuse to learn as flat earthers. One thinks of the Warner Brothers Bugs Bunny cartoon from 1951, in which Columbus and Ferdinand fight against each other, and one screams, "The world, she is flat," and the other, "The world, she is round." And then Columbus ends up meeting Bugs Bunny, and Bugs, always the voice of reason, says, "Well, she looks round to me, Doc." Jeffrey Burton Russell points out that one of the reasons the flat myth remained so popular, particularly in the 19th century, was it appealed to many prejudices. As he puts it, the Protestant prejudice against the Middle Ages for being Catholic, the rationalist prejudice against Judeo-Christianity as a whole, and the assumption of the superiority of our views to those of older cultures. In other words, as we talked about before, presentism.